Go ahead, Anna. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Diana, and it's awesome to be here. It wasn't very long ago that I was in one of your seats taking this seminar class, so really fun to be back. I'm going to, so I know I'm being recorded. I'm gonna bring up my presentation. Let's see. Oh, I should share my screen before I do that. So I'm gonna share.
And we can see your, there we go. Awesome.
Lovely. All right. Again, great to be here and have the chance to speak with all of you today. And thanks for the introduction, Diana. I have really had such great opportunities from before WRS to the work that I did here, and now since being back with USGS, to work kind of across a variety of landscapes and scales. So I decided to call this talk From Farm Fields to Forests, From Rivers to Great Lakes, from USGS to WRS. So I'm excited to share with you a little bit about kind of my career path and how I sort of followed my interests towards where I am today. So today I am a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey's Upper Midwest Water Science Center, which is here in Minnesota. We're actually a 3-state center, and I'm with our Minnesota office, and we are moving to St. Paul campus. So we will be hopefully a resource to all of you and looking to, you know, build collaborations and relationships here on campus. So this is really cool to get to be able to be here today to kind of start meeting folks again. So I geared this talk really towards students, and I saw that there are some colleagues and friends from when I was here at WRS on the line. So thanks for joining and bearing with me through just kind of talking generally about career paths in water science. Many of you who are in the WRS program may have already had some great work experience before coming here, and you may have a really clear idea of where you're headed, or you might be kind of at a point where you're trying to feel things out and get a sense of where you'd like to land. It's a really easy path towards academia working in this program. There's also great opportunities in government that I'll talk a little bit about, kind of what's happening in Minnesota, as well as folks from this program go into private sector and nonprofit as well. I know folks who are with the Nature Conservancy and various consulting firms in Minnesota and beyond. So I love this table from the Minnesota Department of Ag, and if you haven't seen it before, it's a really cool resource for understanding kind of how all of the different state government organizations fit together and what they all contribute to water resources science and water resources management in the state. So it talks about kind of the contributions from Board of Water and Soil Resources, DNR, Department of Health, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Minnesota Department of Ag, and Met Council. And at USGS, we do collaborate with state and local governments all the time. So it's really important to know kind of who's working where and what the different roles are. And I can give these slides to Diana and make these links active for you all afterwards too. There's also a ton of federal government agencies that work on water resources, so various places to kind of look depending on what type of role you'd like to have. Could include the EPA, of course. I'm sure everybody's very familiar with the EPA's role in terms of creating policy for water resources protections. Also Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service, Forest Service, USGS, NOAA, Army Corps of Engineers. We all kind of have like a unique role in working on water resources science, from like providing the science that informs policymaking to doing the policymaking like at EPA, and all the way to like being the boots on the ground that would do a stream restoration or implement any sort of water resources protections like the Army Corps of Engineers often does. So I wanted to talk a little bit about USGS, and USGS is probably a household name around here, but it really depends on kind of what your focus is within water resources science, whether or not you would have crossed paths with USGS very much. So USGS is the kind of lead earth science agency within the federal government, and we have no regulatory authority, which is a thing that I really appreciate about USGS because it drives us towards producing unbiased science in support of policy decision-making. And we are broken into these different mission areas that you see on the right here. So we have a core system science, which is like our mapping division. We have an ecosystems mission area, energy and minerals, natural hazards, and water resources. So I'm in the water resources division of USGS, and we actually collaborate across these mission areas a lot. So I have a colleague in ecosystems who I work with on like a lot of my projects, and there's a lot of kind of mobility. And one of the amazing things about USGS is just the number of expert folks who you are colleagues with and can reach out to across the country. So what do careers with USGS look like? There's kind of a bunch of different series. I'm in the scientist series, so I'm a hydrologist. There's also a technician series, and those are the two most typical entry level career tracks. Scientists will do everything from data collection to analysis to writing interpretive reports and communicating results, designing program and kind of like moving scientific studies ahead. The technician series tends to be folks who are really focused on data collection and creating innovative ways to do that. So there are folks who are in our technical series who really contribute immensely to the collection of our high quality data, which is the backbone of everything we do in USGS. So super important job series. We also have a research scientist program, which if you are pursuing a PhD and you're thinking about staying in a research track and you're really interested in producing publications and driving the science forward, that would be kind of the part of USGS that you might be the most interested in. It's kind of akin to being like a research faculty at a university in terms of writing grants. You are evaluated every 4 years or so on your contributions to the science and your publications. And there's also science leadership positions. So those include like being a director or a science lead who's working with external partners and helping to kind of build science programs. So there's many different pathways that you could take from grad school to the USGS. There are always job postings that open up on USA Jobs, and I'd be happy to talk with anybody who has questions about how to navigate USA Jobs. But I wanted to mention here that a lot of folks who work with USGS started under some kind of internship, and we have two different programs, Pathways and Recent Grad programs, and both of those are internships that can lead directly into a career track, and that can happen non-competitively. So those are really unique and awesome opportunities to get started while you're in grad school and go straight into a career with USGS. We also have a program called the Mendenhall Research Fellowship. And I know a number of fantastic scientists who are part of that program. It's pretty prestigious. I'm not actually sure how often those opportunities come up, but I think there probably are hires through that program every year. So from there, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my path to WRS. Sorry, this is such a busy slide. So I did my undergrad at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, which is kind of right just down the road from here in geology and environmental science. I worked with advisor Catherine Grody and got to do lots of great research as an undergrad, and was fortunate to be nominated for this internship program that was just a summer internship. So it's a collaborative program with the National Association of Geoscience Teachers, and it actually is open to master's and PhD students as well, I believe, but I was one as an undergrad. And got to work on some really fascinating bioremediation, bioaugmentation experiments that they had going at the Water Science Center in New Jersey. And from there, I was still living out east and figuring out what was going to come next, and an opportunity opened up with the Maryland, Delaware, DC Water Science Center, where I was hired to be an entry-level staff working on a bunch of bioremediation experimental projects. So operating anaerobic bioreactors that were used for degraded chlorinated solvents, and got to work with these amazing mentors, Emily Major and Michelle Laura. And after several years of working in the bioremediation world, during my interview when I started with the Maryland Water Science Center, I mentioned how interested I was in Chesapeake Bay science and thinking about non-point source loading to these large surface waters and how that can stimulate algal blooms and kind of that whole story. And I had an opportunity to shift gears and start working with Chesapeake Bay science. So I worked with mentor Alan Gellis on a bunch of projects related to geomorphology and sediment sourcing, and also on some nutrient transport work, but that was focused on nitrogen. And then I attended this meeting that was about phosphorus. And it occurred to me quickly that this was the intersection point between nutrient transport and geomorphology. And I was super excited about the idea of thinking about how river landscapes form and evolve and how that contributes to nutrient transport downstream. So I was also at this point being really pushed towards like, okay, you've been here for some years and you've done a ton of field work, and now like you're gonna step into being the person who's writing grants and writing papers. I had been working under other folks and being mentored by these amazing folks for a number of years. And in order to feel ready to step into project leadership, I knew that I needed grad school. So in my search, I quickly found WRS actually because of my advisor, Karen Gran. Her reputation precedes her very broadly. She's fantastic. And I knew right away that I wanted to work with her. She's a geomorphologist, a fluvial geomorphologist. And in talking with her about the project work that she had going on, she was part of this interdisciplinary research program through the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics, which was focusing on the Minnesota River Basin and erosion issues there. And she was also working with Jacques Finley, who's an aquatic ecologist, and they were interested in kind of bridging their studies of geomorphology and sediment transport in this basin and of the nutrient chemistry and algal ecology. So that was basically the absolutely perfect fit. And I was thrilled to have the opportunity to work with them and also with my committee members, a familiar face here. Diana was on my committee, as was Dan Engstrom of the St. Croix Watershed Research Station, and he was also a faculty member at the U. Another thing that drew me to WRS, in addition to being able to work with advisors from two campuses, from two totally different fields on this awesome interdisciplinary research, Karen also had this really great stakeholder partnership that she was working with called the Collaborative for Sediment Source Reduction. And this was a group that was put together by faculty from the U that was working with state and local government and farmers from the community to build a model to look at what management practices would do the best at reducing sediment loading in a couple of subbasins of the Minnesota River. And I was just really blown away by that approach, and really fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from Karen and others who were part of that project. So now I'm going to jump into kind of some more like research highlights. So some details on the grad project that I worked on with Karen Gran and Jacques Finley. My grad research was focused on the role of sediment in phosphorus loading in the Le Sueur River. So the Le Sueur is a tributary to the Minnesota River. You can see it in bright red in both this phosphorus and sediment map. So the Minnesota River is about 80% agricultural land use, and has a unique evolutionary history, both of which kind of lend it to really extreme erosion. The Minnesota River contributes 80 to 90% of the total suspended solids received by Lake Pepin, which is a dam section of the Mississippi River downstream. And as much as 30% of that comes from the Le Sueur. So in terms of unique evolutionary history, you can see this is a called a long profile. So this is the distance from river mouth and the elevation, and you can see that the Le Sueur is really steep near the mouth of the river, and that's because of the glacial history and the carving of the Minnesota River, and all of the tributaries as they go to meet the Minnesota River have to make this big base level adjustment, so they're very incised in the river mouths. So there are these huge eroding bluff features there, and you can see kind of the mass of sediment that's moving with the Mississippi River here after the Minnesota River has delivered this sediment as it's meeting the St. Croix here. So the project that I worked on in the Minnesota River Basin, focused in the Le Sueur, was working up a sediment-bound phosphorus budget. So essentially, we worked with an existing sediment budget that was developed by my advisor, Karen, and one of her graduate students who preceded me, Martin Beavis, and took the sediment source contribution. So that sediment budget looked at the contributions from bluffs and stream banks and ravines and upland agricultural fields. So we went back to all of these places and we sampled those sediments and we looked at their phosphorus chemistry. And we were able to then predict a load of sediment-bound phosphorus that would come from each of those distinct sources. So what we wanted to do then was compare to measured total phosphorus loads. So this is a picture from a very downstream point on the Le Sueur, where the state has done their monitoring for suspended sediment and total phosphorus loads. And when we compared the totals coming from this estimate, which was based on measured volumes of sediment coming from these different sources and the phosphorus content of those sediments, we were very surprised to find that it only accounted for 24% of the total phosphorus load. And the total phosphorus load breaks out into 63% particulate phosphorus and 37% dissolved phosphorus. And we also did loosely bound phosphorus extractions on these sediments. So essentially we were asking the question, like, when this sediment erodes into the channel, what would be immediately released into solution? So that was only 1% of the dissolved phosphorus. So this, of course, begs the question, what's going on with all of this particulate phosphorus that is maybe not accounted for by this sediment budget and applying phosphorus content to it? So we took some next steps, and we were building on a lot of existing work here. So we carried out these we carried out these sorption experiments. And our sorption experiments were trying to get at the question, how does in-stream phosphorus cycling impact this budget for sediment-bound phosphorus? So sediment can act as a sponge and soak up phosphorus and bind it. Depending on how it's bound, that can be a really tight bond or it can be a potentially more temporary one. So here we were dosing sediments with known concentrations of phosphorus and allowing them to interact and seeing how the solution concentration changed. So here you're seeing this box plot showing kind of the behavior across this range of concentrations of phosphorus. And the agricultural topsoils we found tended to be desorbing phosphorus or lending it to the water column, whereas sediment from bluffs and stream banks tended to bind that phosphorus out of solution. We also looked at ditches in upland agricultural fields and found that those also tended to desorb phosphorus. So bringing this into our phosphorus budgeting scheme, we found that in-stream cycling was only able to account for about 2 to 24% of the particulate phosphorus. And this was the larger figure there was using the maximum sorptive capacity, which is unlikely to be reached. We also did a calculation looking at the potential amount of phosphorus that is particulate that's bound up in algal cells. And that has a lot of assumptions built into it. The kind of typical phosphorus concentration of an algal cell, which can actually vary pretty widely. But we found that was around 4%. So we still have this kind of gap in our understanding of the particulate phosphorus loading. And we, in next steps with this work, we're hoping to kind of do more work on the upland sediments to look at how they accumulate phosphorus and how they may slowly release it over time. So this kind of pointed towards the idea that upland settings may be a kind of slowly leaking source of dissolved phosphorus. Okay, so after graduate school, I was fortunate to be able to transfer to the Minnesota Water Science Center and to build upon kind of the work that I've been doing with my mentors here at the U and with folks from USGS before coming to Minnesota. So there are a couple of projects that I wanted to share some details of, and those are some sediment source tracking that we've been working on in the Little Fork River. So I've shifted from working in a super agricultural setting to working in almost entirely forested watersheds since going back to the USGS. So this project in the Little Fork looking at sediment sources evolved into a study looking at legacy phosphorus in the Rainy Lake of the Woods watershed, which is happening right now. And I also have an ongoing huge collaborative project where we are looking at the influence of watershed nutrients, sediment, and cyanobacteria on nearshore blooms in Lake Superior. And I'm really fortunate to be part of that. It's a really fantastic, large group of people working on that question. So I'll talk a little bit about these. And this is all going to be super high level, but I'm happy to take any questions on these studies. Okay, so this study in the Little Fork is a collaboration with my advisor, Karen Gran, and her student, Andy Kaysen. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is funding it, and we're also working in partnership with 2 of the soil and water conservation districts from the area up there, Coochin County and North St. Louis. So the Little Fork has large sections with sediment-related impairments, and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has established total maximum daily load regulations for these sections and is working to meet a target of 15 milligrams per liter TSS, total suspended solids. Mind you, 15 milligrams per liter TSS is extremely low. Extremely low. I'm seeing Diana's face. So the MPCA has different load reduction targets for different ecoregions in Minnesota, and the Little Fork is in the northern lakes and forests ecoregion, which has much lower target TSS than the agricultural regions of Minnesota. Our collaborators are also interested in sediment that's moving through this watershed from the standpoint of phosphorus transport. So the Little Fork is a disproportionate source of both sediment and phosphorus to downstream Lake of the Woods. And you see here a picture of Lake of the Woods from 2015. In October, that tends to be kind of peak bloom season on Lake of the Woods. So the history of erosion in the Little Fork can potentially be tied to the changing land use there. There was a study done in 2006 by our collaborator, Jesse Anderson, that looked at about 100 years of stream gauge record, which we are fortunate to have for this basin. And that really showed some dramatic changes with the history of logging, some big increases in peak flows that corresponded to the timing of major deforestation in this basin. And it is a predominantly forested basin, mostly forest and wetland, actually. There was a great study done in 2007 by Karen Gran that looked at the geomorphology of the system and that identified areas that were potentially especially sensitive to erosion. And in 2016, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency established their total maximum daily load regulations. But in order to implement that, they had additional questions about sediment sources and how to target their efforts to reduce sediment loads. So that's where they reached out to the USGS. They had heard about the sediment fingerprinting programs that have taken place through USGS and asked us to do one of these studies. So sediment fingerprinting is a method for determining sediment sources that uses chemical tracers to differentiate sources. It's an EPA-approved method, and there's actually kind of a manual that was put together on how to track sediment sources in watersheds, and this is one of the main methods they describe. And that was put together by two mentors of mine, Alan Gallus and Faith Fitzpatrick, and a collaborator of theirs from EPA. So sediment fingerprinting tries to distinguish between stream corridor sources of sediment and upland sources of sediment using the geochemistry. There's actually a lot of different kind of geochemical tracers that you can use for sediment fingerprinting. We are using elemental or metals chemistry. And you look at the mix of those signatures in a fluvial sediment, so a suspended sediment or a stream bed sediment. We also use a complementary method to the sediment fingerprinting to get more detail within the stream corridor. So that's a sediment budget method, and that uses manual measurements of eroding stream banks. There's actually a lot of different ways to get at a sediment budget. The methods that we are using involve manual measurements of eroding stream banks and in-stream measurements of bed sediment and deposition. And then we connect that to the flux of sediment out of the watershed. So this is an in-stream sediment sampler pictured here. The water flows through, the sediment settles out, and that's how we get enough suspended sediment to do these geochemical analyses. So just quick high level on the data sets that we collected. We have a set of upland source sediments. We tend to base the upland source categories on predominant land cover and geology. The almost entire basin here is the geology is glacial, and it I think will be probably pretty hard to differentiate between the two glacial lobes that overlap this basin. So we are focused mostly on the land cover here. So we're looking at mature forest and areas that have experienced harvest recently. This says 2019 to present. It's 2019 to 2021, which is when we were doing some of the sampling. We also look at sediment coming from roadways and agricultural fields. Agriculture is a tiny percent of the land cover in this basin. However, a lot of those lands were right adjacent to the stream corridor and are regularly tilled. So we were interested in seeing that potential signature. In the near channel, we collected source sediments from stream banks and ravines, and we collected those during our rapid geomorphic assessments, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then we collected target sediment in the form of stream bed and suspended sediment. And all these sediments receive elemental chemistry analysis as well as grain size and organic content, which are two factors that are used to kind of correct the data because they influence concentrations. So this is where we're headed, and we are actually working on the sediment fingerprinting model right now. We are running this through a tool that was built by folks from USGS that takes you through the entire statistical process of applying corrections for grain size and organics, making sure that the fluvial samples fall within the source sample concentrations. And then at the heart of the sediment fingerprinting is a stepwise discriminant function analysis, which basically helps you determine the combination of tracers that form a fingerprint for a specific source category. Then you take those sources for each fluvial sediment and you do an unmixing model to determine where that sediment came from. And then there's a bunch of great error analysis. So here's an example from a difficult run in Virginia, where basically they're taking the suspended sediment concentration from all these different time points and apportioning it back to its sources. And here this is showing predominantly stream bank signature. So we also collected a great deal of rapid geomorphic assessment data. So this is to inform our channel corridor sediment budget. So that included measurements of channel geometry, measurements of the eroding stream bank, extent and severity, as well as the deposited bed sediment. And while we were doing that, we collected our sediments from stream banks and stream bed. And then essentially, we take the information from these carefully chosen sites, which were chosen to represent kind of a range of scales. This is an 1,800 square mile basin. It's very large for sediment fingerprinting. And we have to take the information from these point locations and extrapolate it to the entire network. There's lots of details about how we did that I would be happy to share, but I'm going to skip right to the results on this. So the rapid geomorphic assessment results showed, interestingly, that some ravines were contributing nearly as much sediment or more in some cases. This is a mix of river and ravine sites. More sediment than some ravines. My apologies. More sediment was coming from some ravines than from some tributaries. When we extrapolated the results of the rapid geomorphic assessments across the stream network, we found that stream corridor erosion is likely to account for a large portion of the total budget. So when they were all summed up, the fine sediment coming from stream corridor erosion was about 38,700 megagrams per year. And the measured load on average over about a 10-year time span was 58 megagrams per year at the downstream Little Fork gauge. We also found, we kind of broke up the results by stream order, and we were able to determine which areas fall into the ravine category based on their slopes. And tallying that up, we determined that ravines may contribute as much as 50% of that corridor load, which is very high. So that's pretty interesting and potentially informative for our resource management partners about where focused management might have the biggest impact. So from there, that project has grown into this study on legacy phosphorus in the downstream Rainy River. So again, here, this photo of Lake of the Woods, this satellite imagery. Lake of the Woods has a total maximum daily load study that was completed in 2020. And the primary focus of that is to work on reducing blooms by reducing nutrient inputs, in particular phosphorus, which tends to be what we focus on in freshwaters. And there's lots to be said about that as well. But a mass balance that was done in 2009 by Catherine Hargan and others showed that as much as 75% of the new inputs of phosphorus to the Lake of the Woods system come from Rainy River, so hence the focus there. And our partners from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency wanted to know how much phosphorus is stored in Rainy River sediments and how much new phosphorus is coming in for tributaries in Minnesota. I apologize that that was out of order, but they're interested in whether legacy phosphorus from the Rainy may be driving blooms in Lake of the Woods. I'll just define legacy phosphorus here as phosphorus that's bound to sediments. We could also have like hours-long conversation about what legacy phosphorus is. And they're also interested in how likely it is that that sediment-bound phosphorus from these distinct sources would contribute to fueling algal blooms downstream. So the study that we designed is in partnership with the St. Croix Watershed Research Station and PCA, our Soil and Water Conservation District partners. And we also have an advisor on the project from Environment Climate Change Canada. And this project is funded by the Environment Natural Resources Trust Fund through the LCCMR, which some of you may have heard about, which is an amazing thing that exists in Minnesota in terms of funding water resources studies. So our approach to answering these questions is kind of this three-tiered study. Super generally, we are aiming to map streambed fine sediment deposits and look at their phosphorus storage. We plan to look at the history of sediment-bound phosphorus deposition in 4 Mile Bay with some sediment coring. And the St. Croix Watershed Research Station folks have done a ton of coring in Lake of the Woods and looked at the history of phosphorus loading there, as well as the algal community using algal pigments. And we're also planning to assess new inputs of sediment-bound phosphorus coming from tributaries in Minnesota. So just super briefly, we did our preliminary survey of sediment thickness just a few weeks ago. So this is incredibly hot off the press data that is in the process of being worked up. We were collecting sediment thickness data using ground penetrating radar and seismic, and we also took manual measurements. So we were out there with a metal pole, sticking it in the sediment and seeing how far it would go. So this plot is showing the correspondence between the seismic hardness coefficient and the depth of our soundings. So we had soft sediment through here, and you're seeing that that kind of correlates to this hardness coefficient. So we have quite a large amount of data that we are going to be working up over the next several months, and then we will be out sampling next season. So lastly, last kind of research highlight is on our studies in Lake Superior, which has a huge group of collaborators on it. We are working on linking nutrient dynamics to microbial community. So it's been really great to go kind of from geomorphology and thinking about sediment transport and sources of erosion to thinking about phosphorus that's like stored in the river corridor, to then this project is actually like linking to the microbial dynamics in the nearshore environment. Algal blooms on Lake Superior are short-lived, infrequent, but very concerning because this is a highly oligotrophic lake. So there's a lot of interest in what might be driving these, and is it possible that they would become more severe with climate change? So this is just one slide that has a lot of information on it, but the objectives of our study are to assess how cyanobacterial seeding, which is basically cyanobacteria being contributed from the watershed into a nearshore environment. So how cyanobacterial seeding, nutrient sediment loading, and tributary nutrient cycling contribute to the formation of cyanobacterial blooms in the nearshore of Lake Superior. And so we have been collecting water, chemistry, suspended sediment, and stream bed sediment samples in 2 key tributaries that are big sediment producers. And one of them is very near the Apostle Islands and the sea caves, where they have had repeated blooms of some of the most severe blooms that have happened in the near shore of South Shore Lake Superior. So the results of this, we hope, are going to help our resource managers understand kind of what some of these contributing factors are to bloom initiation. And we are at the very beginning stages of kind of bringing together results of the microbial studies, which are looking at kind of the community and who's there at different points in time, and our information about nutrient cycling. Also, I just want to point out, this is a huge multi-agency collaboration. So the points that you see here, where the points are circled, these are the tributaries we're working in. But every different color is a different agency contributing to this effort. So here's some super preliminary findings. We saw a really strong relationship between stream flow and export of both sediment and phosphorus, and a really strong relationship between sediment and phosphorus concentrations, which was really interesting to see across both of these 2 tributaries. We also did, my colleague from the ecosystems branch of USGS that's located in La Crosse does a lot of great experimental work, and she did phosphorus sorption studies and saw that a majority of the stream bed sediments that she collected were able to bind phosphorus out of the water column at concentrations that were typical of the time period that was where the sediments were sampled. So this is looking at the equilibrium of phosphorus on sediments. But there were 2 locations in the Bois Brule watershed where she saw desorption of phosphorus off of sediments, and those happened to both be from a tributary that has agricultural land use. So this is a predominantly forested watershed with a small tributary that has agricultural land use. So that was very interesting to see. And looking forward to bringing this story together with the microbial side of things. So some of my big picture takeaways from having been with USGS for many years and having had the incredible opportunity to further my career here at U of M through the WRS program, collaborations make so many things possible. So it just is such a privilege to work with folks that have such broad expertise, and you really can answer some challenging questions when you bring folks together on it. Paying attention to the facets of your work that excite you the most and seeking those out in your future job can be really rewarding. I kind of can't believe that I have landed where I have sometimes. Like, I'm doing exactly the kind of research that I have been most excited about. And that's just been thanks to the opportunities I've been given by amazing mentors and being able to just keep asking questions and following those. Also, that voicing what you're interested in is really crucial no matter where you are, whether that's grad school or in a job. In an interview, folks really love to hear kind of what you're most excited about. I also just wanted to put a plug in for your work-life balance, which is important now as much as in future career. And also just that the connections that you make at every step are incredibly valuable. I'm so lucky to still be working with folks that I worked with in grad school and before when I was at USGS in Maryland. So I wanted to just end with questions for you and thought that maybe this could spark some discussion. I would love to hear about what you've been most enjoying about grad school, what you're interested in studying, what have you enjoyed about jobs or internships you've had? Is there anything you've been like dreaming of doing and haven't had the opportunity yet? And do you have a sense of what kind of job you're thinking about moving into post-grad school? And I would love to like have a conversation about that now. And also like, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact info is here. And huge thanks to my advisors, Karen Gran and Jacques Finley, and my committee members, Diana and Dan, and so many colleagues and collaborators from USGS, NPCA, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and then the folks on Lake Superior I have listed down here at the bottom, and I'm afraid I may have even missed some because there are so many collaborators on this, from Wisconsin DNR to Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, UMN Large Lakes Observatory, Park Service, EPA, the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve. Yeah, so just big thanks. And maybe I'll go back to this one in case folks want to chat about any of that. And also happy to take any questions on research stuff.
Yeah, and also just, Anna, so you know, I have the chat open. If it helps for you to be able to answer questions, I can help facilitate if there's stuff that comes in the chat.
Okay.
As well.
Any questions on research stuff?
Really quickly, Anna, you mentioned that you work with people from grad school. Are you working with any other WRS grads right now?
Yes, and I actually was wanting to put together a slide on that. So the Lake Superior project, as I mentioned, is in collaboration with the Wisconsin DNR and the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve. 2 WRS grads are the folks who represent for those organizations on that project, Kate Reinl, and Ellen Kaufman, formerly Ellen Cooney. And actually at USGS here in Minnesota, we have quite a few grads of the WRS program. You'll hear from my supervisor, Joel Groten, in a couple of weeks. Sarah Elliott, who does a lot of work on emerging contaminants also went through the WRS program. And I'm sure that there are others. But, and also Andy Kaysen, who is a student of Karen Grand's, was a collaborator as well. So yeah, lots of WRS folks. And Christy Dolph too, I think was a WRS alum and part of the Minnesota River Basin Studies. So yeah, lots of really great kind of next steps that folks have taken from WRS into really interesting research careers.
What is like a day in the life of your job? Because it sounds like you've got these 3 projects going on, lots of research and things, but does it kind of, is every day a little bit different in that respect?
Yeah, that's part of what I've always loved about working for USGS. You get to do a little bit of everything, and you can kind of steer that by writing grants and kind of creating a path for the research. It really depends on kind of the time of year and what's happening. In the spring, we're gearing up for snowmelt sampling. I do still get to do field work, which is great. I think I spent probably a solid month in the field a couple summers ago, maybe even more, doing those rapid geomorphic assessments. So anything from field work to sample preparation to working in the lab. I do a lot of data analysis and kind of overseeing the programs. I actually sit on a lot of boards now. So like I'm our representative for the Upper Midwest Water Science Center on the Lake Superior Working Group Partnership, which is like an intergovernmental organization that kind of coordinates all the research and management on Lake Superior. So that's been really cool. There's lots of opportunities to kind of get involved in that like multi-agency collaborative side of things, and to contribute to the organization. And that's been really exciting too. Also, I've been involved a tiny bit with the Minnesota Nutrient Reduction Strategy. So there are lots of opportunities like that to kind of take part in these big collaborative efforts. And also there's a lot of time spent on, you know, budgets and administrative things and that kind of stuff. It's that time of year right now, it's like budget time. And also writing proposals, and those kind of are on a cycle. So there's certain times of year where you're really busy with bringing ideas together and trying to figure out what comes next. It's a great question though.
Is here? Peter, go ahead.
I was just curious, the TSS with TP plots, are those from what publication or are those not published?
Okay, can you hear up there or down there as it were? Okay, so the question was about Peter, what TSS versus TP plots. Are those published or are they in the works?
They are in the works. They are in a draft report, like to the funding source on the project, but we're also working on a draft publication that will be submitted to a special issue of the Journal of Great Lakes Research that's focused on Lake Superior. And those are due sometime this winter, so hopefully published soon. If we were all in the same room, I would go around and want to like hear about what everybody is working on.
I think a lot of overlap with the work that you're doing up here.
Cool.
Yeah, a
That's
lot of
great to
watershed
hear.
work and obviously a lot of Lake Superior work.
Awesome. Are there students in the room in Duluth who are working on issues related to algal blooms or nutrients in Lake Superior and tributaries to Lake Superior? Awesome.
I see 3 hands went up, 4 hands went up immediately.
4 hands.
Yeah,
Nice.
out of what we have 20 or so up here. So
Awesome.
And maybe one of you could just, in 30 seconds, volunteer what your focus is. Sorry.
I'm working on the
Here, so she can hear. Sorry about that.
I'm working on the role of trace mineral nutrient limitation within Dolichospermum in both the watersheds like Sisquit River, which you had on your map,
Ah, yeah.
and then Sisquit Bay, and then an offshore site. So a lot of metals, and then I'm also doing a bioinformatics metatranscriptomics analysis on the communities present under these different nutrient treatments.
Awesome.
There you go. So yeah,
Awesome. So that's with Bob Sterner,
thank you, Rob.
I assume. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard about your project and can't wait to see the results of it.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Great. I looks like we're good up here.
Okay.
Anna, thanks again.
Absolutely.
I'm just curious, you spoke to a lot of different tasks and things that are involved in your job right now. And when you were in this program, what were the things that you enjoyed, and what, outside of the position you have now, or other things that you considered with like your next steps?
I really loved mentoring undergrads. That was like one of my favorite aspects of the work. They contributed so much in the field and in the lab and intellectually to the project. It was just like so gratifying working with them. And yeah, so I think that's probably the piece that took the longest to bring back into my work. This past summer, I hired an intern for the first time, and actually ended up having 2 interns that were working with me, and that was so awesome and so fun. But yeah, I just always especially enjoyed kind of like the field component and the sort of like big picture, bringing 2 disparate disciplines together. Yeah, and that undergraduate mentoring piece was super fun too. Yeah, thank you.
You said after you got your master's here, you went into the Water Resources Center, is that right? Or I forget what the next step was. I just wanted to talk more about like what you did immediately after master's.
Sure. Yeah, so I started working with the USGS here, the Minnesota Water Science Center, actually before I graduated. So I started kind of connecting with folks when I was looking at U of M as a school, and was kind of thinking down the road to like, would I be transferring out here? Would I be going back to Maryland? Would I be like continuing on in an academic path, which I did consider, and think I could have also really enjoyed. But there was an opportunity to contribute to a groundwater modeling project that they really needed someone like right away, and I was here and able to kind of jump right into it. So I think it was maybe 6 months or more before I graduated that I started working there, and then kind of just like stepped right into it. So I was working on someone else's project for at least the first year of being back with USGS, and then this opportunity to look at sediment sources in the Little Fork popped up, and that was a connection actually made by my supervisor, who's someone who is, you know, kind of networking with different cooperators around the sediment program, and made that connection. So yeah, thank you.
Well, let's thank Anna for her time and sharing.
Thanks all.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks again.